There are mysteries that fade with time, and then there are mysteries that grow. The kind that refuse to be buried, that resurface every few years with a new clue, a whispered rumor, or a piece of debris washing ashore on a cold California morning. The 1962 escape from Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary is exactly that kind of mystery. One that has outlasted the prison itself, outlasted the investigators who chased it, and may have now, more than 6 decades later, finally found something resembling an answer. In 2025, a team of researchers announced findings so precise and so methodically constructed that the conversation around this case has shifted in ways nobody quite expected. Not a confession, not a body. Something far more unsettling, science that actually makes survival look possible, even probable. But to understand what that means, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand what Alcatraz really was, what it was built to represent, and why 3 men decided to challenge it on a cold June night in 1962. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary sits on a rocky island 1.25 miles off the coast of San Francisco. It began its life as a military fortification in the mid-1800s before the federal government transformed it into a maximum security prison in 1934. From the moment it opened its doors as a penitentiary, Alcatraz was not designed to rehabilitate. It was designed to contain. The prison held its population to around 260 to 300 inmates at any given time, but the quality of control over those inmates was unlike anything seen elsewhere in the American correctional system. Guards outnumbered prisoners at a ratio that was, at the time, unmatched nationally. Inmates were counted up to 13 times every single day. The cells were narrow, stripped of comfort, and sealed with tool-resistant steel. The dining hall, the library, the work assignments, every moment of every day was structured, monitored, and controlled. The island itself was considered the final layer of security. San Francisco Bay is not a forgiving body of water. Its currents move in unpredictable patterns, shaped by tidal shifts and the geography of the bay's floor. The water temperature sits between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit for much of the year, cold enough to cause hypothermia in a matter of minutes without proper protection. The distance from the island to the nearest shoreline, while not enormous in miles, is enormous in terms of what it demands from a swimmer or a makeshift raft navigating those currents in the dark. Prison officials, wardens, and federal authorities leaned heavily on this geography. They didn't just manage Alcatraz as a prison, they marketed it as an impossibility. Escape was not merely difficult. It was, according to every official voice, a death sentence wearing the costume of a plan. Between 1934 and 1963, there were 14 documented escape attempts at Alcatraz. Nearly all of them ended in capture, death, or disappearance into the bay. Not one was confirmed successful. That record became the cornerstone of Alcatraz's identity. The prison's power was psychological as much as it was physical. When inmates arrived on the island, they weren't just entering a building, they were absorbing a message. You are here because every other system failed to hold you. This one will not. And for 29 years that message held up. Until June 11, 1962, when 3 men decided to test it in a way nobody had ever seriously attempted before. Frank Lee Morris was not a man the system had treated kindly, and he had spent most of his life returning the favor. Orphaned before he turned 12, cycling through foster homes and juvenile institutions, Morris developed something in those years of instability that no amount of institutional hardship could take away. An extraordinary ability to observe, to analyze, and to plan. His criminal record included armed robbery and multiple successful escapes from other facilities, which was precisely why he ended up at Alcatraz in January 1960. The Bureau of Prisons sent men like Morris to the Rock because they believed the island would do what bars and walls alone could not. What they didn't account for was that Morris would spend every waking hour studying the place looking for the cracks. He found them. Alcatraz, for all its fearsome reputation, was an aging structure sitting in one of the most corrosive environments imaginable. Saltwater doesn't just rust metal, it eats into concrete over years and decades, weakening it from the inside. The cells in B and C block had air vents at their base, just beneath the sinks, and behind those vents the concrete had been quietly deteriorating for years. Morris noticed. He also noticed that above the top tier of cells, there was an unguarded utility corridor, and above that, an area of the roof that was rarely if ever monitored. The prison's age and its saltwater-damaged infrastructure weren't problems that had been overlooked. They had been accepted as irrelevant, because nobody was supposed to be able to exploit them. Morris saw things differently. John and Clarence Anglin came from a large, poor family in rural Florida, one of 13 siblings who grew up with very little and relied on each other for everything. That bond between brothers, formed in hardship and maintained through years of shared criminal activity and shared prison time, made them something unusual in a correctional environment, a team that actually trusted each other completely. Like Morris, they had crossed paths with him in other facilities before all three ended up at Alcatraz. When the prison placed their cells in close proximity to Morris, it created, entirely by accident, one of the most capable and determined escape teams in American criminal history. The plan they built together over the better part of a year was staggering in its detail. Using metal spoons stolen from the dining hall, discarded saw blades, and a drill they constructed from a vacuum cleaner motor, the men began slowly chipping through the salt-weakened concrete behind their cell vents. The work was done quietly, carefully, and over a period of months. To cover the noise of drilling, Morris played his accordion during the prison's designated music hour, the wheezing, scratching sound of the instrument masking the equally wheezing, scratching sound of tools working against crumbling concrete. When they weren't digging, the holes were covered with false vent grills fashioned from cardboard and magazine paper, painted with art supplies Morris sourced from the prison library and maintenance shop. They matched the wall so precisely that guards conducting routine checks walked right past them without a second glance. The deception extended beyond the walls. Morris and the Anglin brothers crafted dummy heads to leave in their beds during the escape, sculpted from a mixture of soap, toothpaste, and toilet paper, painted in skin tones, and topped with real human hair swept from the prison barbershop. The figures were placed on pillows, covered with blankets, and arranged to suggest sleeping men. Alcatraz guards performing nighttime head counts did not physically disturb sleeping prisoners. They looked into the cell and moved on. The dummies held up through multiple checks. When the guards finally discovered on the morning of June 12 that they were looking at sculptures instead of inmates, Morris and the Anglins had been gone for hours. Once through the vents, the men accessed the unguarded utility corridor behind their cells, climbed 30 feet up plumbing pipes to reach the roof, removed a ventilation cover, replacing the bolts with soap replicas so the tampering wouldn't be immediately obvious, and made their way down to the northeastern shore of the island. There, they inflated a raft constructed from more than 50 stolen raincoats, stitched together with thread and sealed with rubber melted using the prison's own steam pipes. Paddles carved from plywood scraps were ready. A converted concertina served as an air pump. Everything was homemade. Everything was hidden in plain sight for months, and everything worked. At some point between 11 at night and midnight, they launched the raft into the darkness and the cold and disappeared. The fourth member of the group, Alan West, didn't make it. His tunnel was too narrow, the final section of concrete refusing to give in time. By the time he broke through, Morris and the Anglin brothers were already gone. West remained on the island, and in the days that followed he cooperated with investigators, providing the first detailed account of the plan, the route, the workshop above the cells, the intended destination of Angel Island. His testimony gave law enforcement its first real picture of what had happened. It also gave them almost nothing useful in terms of finding the men. The escapees, it appeared, had anticipated that West might talk and had built enough flexibility into their plan that no single piece of information West could offer would definitively lead to their capture. What came next was a long, often frustrating investigation that turned up fragments but never answers. A paddle found floating in the bay. A wrapped parcel containing personal items belonging to the Anglins. Pieces of the raft washing ashore near the Golden Gate Bridge. Homemade life vest. These fragments told investigators that the men had made it into the water. They told investigators nothing about what happened after that. The FBI pursued the case for 17 years before closing it in 1979, declaring Morris and the Anglin brothers legally dead. The official conclusion was that they had drowned. The bay had won. The myth of Alcatraz, cracked but not shattered, held its final line. But the case refused to die completely. The Anglin family, over the years, quietly insisted that John and Clarence had survived. They spoke of Christmas cards received after the escape, of photographs, of a 1975 image allegedly showing both brothers in Brazil, older but recognizable. These claims were never verified, but they were never definitively disproved either. Then in 2013, a letter arrived at the San Francisco Police Department, allegedly written by John Anglin. The letter stated plainly that all three men had survived the escape that night. It claimed that Frank Morris had died in 2005, that Clarence Anglin had passed in 2008, and that John himself was now elderly and seriously ill, willing to turn himself in if law enforcement would guarantee him medical treatment. The FBI reopened its examination of the case. Forensic teams analyzed the handwriting, attempted to extract fingerprints, sought any trace of usable DNA. The results were inconclusive. The letter was real enough to take seriously. It wasn't verifiable enough to act on. The case returned to its familiar state of suspended uncertainty. Then came 2025, and the scientific development that has genuinely changed this conversation. Building on earlier work, particularly a 2014 study by Dutch researchers who used computer modeling to reconstruct the tidal conditions of San Francisco Bay on the night of June 11, 1962. A new team of scientists applied significantly more advanced hydrodynamic modeling techniques to the same problem. Where the 2014 study established that a narrow window existed between approximately 11 p.m. and midnight during which the currents could have carried a raft from Alcatraz toward Angel Island rather than out to sea, the 2025 research went considerably further. The new modeling incorporated detailed analysis of that specific night's wind conditions, water temperature gradients, the weight and buoyancy characteristics of a raft constructed from raincoat material, and the likely paddling capacity of three men of the escapees' known physical profiles. The conclusion was not vague. If the raft launched within that window, with those conditions, three men of average fitness using homemade paddles had a statistically viable, not merely possible but genuinely viable chance of reaching shore. The 2025 findings also addressed something that previous analyses had left largely untouched: what happened after the bay. Using records from the period, census data, law enforcement reports, Social Security records, and a range of archival sources from states along the Pacific coast and in the South, researchers attempted to trace whether any anomalies existed in the years following 1962 that might suggest three men living under false identities. What they found was not a smoking gun. It was something more nuanced, a pattern of small gaps and inconsistencies in records that, taken individually, mean nothing, but when mapped against the timeline and geography of the escape, create what the lead researcher described as a circumstantial trail that is difficult to explain away. None of this constitutes proof. It is not a confession and it is not a body. But it is, according to several independent experts who reviewed the work, the most methodologically serious case ever made for the possibility that the three men survived. The U.S. Marshals Service, which has technically maintained jurisdiction over the case since the FBI closed it, responded to the 2025 findings by confirming that the case remains open and that the new research has been reviewed by their investigators. They released no further statements. That silence is itself something. Authorities who were once quick to cite the bay's hostility as proof of the men's deaths have grown noticeably quieter on that point as the scientific evidence has accumulated. What does any of this mean? More than 60 years after three men crawled through a hole in the wall of a maximum security island prison and vanished into the fog. It means that the official story, that Alcatraz was inescapable, that the bay was the final verdict, that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers simply drowned and were never found, has never been as solid as it was presented. It means that a group of men with no formal education in engineering, no access to proper tools, no outside assistance, and no margin for error built a plan so precise that it has taken decades of advancing science to even begin to evaluate it fairly. And it means that somewhere in the layered history of this country, in the overlap between criminality and ingenuity and desperation and the very human refusal to accept that a wall cannot be climbed, there is a story that still doesn't have an ending. Whether Morris and the Anglins made it to Angel Island that night, stumbled ashore somewhere along the Marin County coastline, and disappeared into ordinary American life, Working jobs, keeping quiet, growing old under names that were never theirs, or whether the bay did in fact take them somewhere in that cold darkness, the fact remains that nobody knows. Not for certain. The 2025 research has made survival look more credible than it has ever looked before. It has not made it confirmed. The case is still open. The marshals are still watching. And somewhere, if any of this is real, there may still be someone who knows the truth and has kept it for over 60 years. That is the thing about Alcatraz that no amount of concrete or cold water or official declaration has ever managed to kill. Question. The nagging, stubborn, endlessly renewable question of whether 3 men beat the system so completely that the system never found them. In 2025, science came closer than ever to suggesting the answer might be yes. But closer is not the same as there. And this mystery, like the island it was born on, does not give up its secrets easily.